All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started with the next session. Dr. McBride. There you go. Thank you so much. So this session is entitled Challenges and Opportunities in Resident Education. Everybody will have a seat, please. I'd appreciate it. So this is a topic that we could talk about for much longer than 45 minutes. I didn't put this session together, but I could tell you that if I were going to put the session together, these are the people that I would put on the stage. There's a lot of experience up here. Dr. Desanike is the chair of surgery at Texas Tech. She's had various leadership roles in numerous organizations. I'm not going to go through all of the details of their experience. Some of these will come up as we talk more. Dr. Dent's the vice chair of education at UT San Antonio. He's had roles with the American Board of Surgery, most recently as the chair of the qualifying exam, and then more recently with the ACGME. Again, some of these will come into context here. Dr. Jason Johnson is the program director at St. Joe's in Denver. He has an interesting kind of mix of practice of acute care, MIS, and bariatrics. And then Dr. McBride, who's joined us on the podium, is at the University of Nebraska. And she's had some really interesting experience with the ASMBS. And again, some of that experience is going to come into relevance here shortly. I'm Mike Truitt. I'm from Methodist Dallas. I'm the clown to this four-ring circus you see up here. I'm going to ask each of these panelists one question to them specifically. Some of them are germane to their experience. And then we'll have the other panelists chime in, and we're interested to hear what the audience has to say as well. So my first question is for Dr. Dent. True or false? All residencies are basically the same. I hear this every year during interviews. They come in and they say, hey, pretty much all the programs are the same. That's what I've been told. And so I'm going to ask Dr. Dent, are all residencies basically the same?
I'll go with yes and no. And I think you need a historical context for this. Dr. Potts is sitting up here in the front, and he might be able to add to what I'm saying. But if you look at the pre-ACGME days, the range between the best and the worst programs was vast. And because of ACGME standards, meeting those standards from many programs has elevated them to a higher level. So the range between top and bottom in terms of quality of training, I think, has been reduced significantly. To meet ACGME and American Board of Surgery standards, you have to have a lot of things alike from residency to residency. That being said, I think there's two major differences as you look around at the various residencies. One is there are programs that have strengths and weaknesses. If you look around some of the big cities with a bunch of residency programs, people will tell you, go to that program if you want a great trauma experience, go to that program if you want a great MIS experience, and that program has the big cancer center. And so there are some differences even within the requirements that you have to meet for the ACGME and the American Board of Surgery. And then I'd also add that to me, one of the biggest challenges, and this was the topic of my presidential address of APDS, is how good is your worst graduate? What's the lowest person, the lowest standard you'll let get through your program? And there are some programs that set really high bars for everybody, and there are some programs that put out a number of good graduates, but they don't guarantee that their worst graduate is someone you'd want to operate on you or your family. And I think that's where we have a lot of room for improvement.
Any of the other panelists have comments?
So that's a question we almost can't let go, right? It's like the red flag to the bull. So I'm going to comment a little bit that, so full disclosure, I sit on the RRC, and the entire job of the RRC that's part of the ACGME is to make sure that our standards are reasonable, that they provide the public with a sense of safety, that everyone who does graduate is a competent general surgeon, and that things are the same. So just like Dan said, there's a whole industry built around making sure it's the same. But that said, there are programs that are going to churn out surgeons who are more academically inclined and have done research. And there are surgeons that are going to be more hands-on and have had more operative experience and had a broader spectrum of experience. And there are programs where they may graduate never having seen a Whipple, right? Or a laparoscopic common bile duct exploration. So there is variability and every program is not the same. And I do think that the questions you ask to determine which program is the right fit for a particular candidate depends a lot on what that candidate wants to get out of it. Understanding that a lot of the bare minimums will be the same, but it's these sort of nuances, the devil's in the details.
I'm going to say what he and she said, because I think that's about as eloquent as I can be. But being a community hospital, it is, you oftentimes go through identity crisis because it's, in some sense, we're competing with the academic centers for applicants, but also in another sense, depending on where our residents go, market demands may demand they have fellowship training, and it's sometimes a little more challenging. So I think whenever you're looking at programs to have that bare minimum requirement, but also I think part of the recruiting process is to level set expectations on where they can go when they complete your program. So there's going to be some variables in each program that I think you have to be real transparent in that recruiting process.
No problem. So I would actually propose that what Dan said is correct. In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. And I would say kudos to SCORE because there's really, you think about it, there's really two main areas where you could have this dichotomy, right? You have the medical knowledge portion of it. And I would say previously the medical knowledge you gained at one program is not the same as what you gained as another. I remember my first day as an attending, sitting in our conference room and sort of being angry because I said, I didn't get this. And I trained at a great program. I loved it. I enjoyed thoroughly my time there. I came out as a well-trained surgeon, but our didactics were not like what I saw when I came to Dallas into the program. So previously, I would say there was a pretty significant differential in the didactics. With SCORE, that's sort of been, playing field's been even with This Week in SCORE and kind of emphasizing, before it was whatever you emphasized locally, and you had to make sure you covered all the topics. Now then that standard has been raised. So now I think what we have left is really the operative differential, right? Like Dr. Dent and others said. So what cases are you exposed to? How many Whipples? Are you doing the 1.2 or 1.5 Whipples? Or are you doing the 15 Whipples? Are you doing the bare minimum of trauma laparotomies? Or are you doing 80 or 100? Are you doing MIS and robotics and endoscopy? Or is like laparoscopy your place still basically chole, appy, and occasional colon? And so I think that's where we move next. And so I do love listening to the applicants as they come in though, because they are convinced that every program is a cookie cutter and really the only differentiators are geography and maybe surgical culture. And I think we're closer to that than we've ever been, but I don't think we're there quite yet. All right, next question, Dr. McBride. USMLE step 1, pass, fail. Where do we go from here?
That's a really good question. And in full disclosure, I am not our program director, but our program director is one of my partners and good friends. And she and I have had this conversation multiple times. And I think what this is going to do is I think it's going to shift a lot of focus to their step 2 scores. It's going to shift a lot of focus to what is put on their individual rotation evaluations, therefore what ends up in the dean's letter. It's also going to put a lot of focus on their letters of recommendation themselves. So it behooves us as people who write letters of recommendation to make sure we're very clear. But we also have to check our bias. I think a lot of us, when we read letters of recommendation, if it comes from someone we know, we add value to it. If it comes from a place we've never heard of, or it's written by someone we've never heard of, we downgrade its value rather than read the content of it. And if we do that, we're really doing a disservice. But all of that is really about getting them to the interview. And then I think, assuming you grant them an interview, the interview is really going to become, I think, the single most important thing, because then it does speak to the culture. Is this someone you are going to want to spend the time with? Is this someone that you feel is teachable, trainable with your style of teaching and training? I'd love to believe they're all trainable, but I think we've all seen cases where that maybe is more, so some of them are more of a project than others. But which one will fit best into your culture? So it's about I think there's things that are important to you to get to should you grant them an interview. And then there's the things that you evaluate after you've granted them an interview. And you have to put that final list together.
Other panelists? Everybody doesn't have to answer on every question, but if you have an opinion or something you think would be valuable, feel free to chime in.
I think we this year tried to level set that in preparation, kind of to develop some processes. But it is going to be a bit of a culture shift. And one of the things that I've gone back and looked at who of my residents that have struggled the most academically. And honestly, some of them that have struggled the most academically were my highest USMLE scorers. And it's really hard to describe that and put that into words. And so there's not a direct correlation between a super high USMLE score and what we would consider a high performer in our residency. And I'm reading a book right now called The Infinite Game, and they look at Navy SEAL training, and what they don't want is high performers that are bad fits. And sometimes we look at the USMLE score as they're a high performer, therefore they must be a good fit, but they will get weeded out of big, high efficiency organizations. And I think that's the challenge on us, is to find out in our individual programs, who are those high performers, but also those good fits. And so you take that number out of the equation, and it makes it a little bit more challenging.
Some of you know Amy Gardner and Brian Duncan have kind of taken on this idea of fit in culture, and Dan's program, and I think Tech as well, and maybe others that I'm just not privy to the info, have kind of done some work trying to do some survey type work with both the organization, the attendings, and the applicants to try to find alignment there. It's been the very early stages. We talk about interview science. I feel like those words shouldn't be used in the same sentence. If the NFL draft and the recruiting services would spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to find fit between organizations and players and predict success, can't do it. I think probably we're not going to be able to do it, at least not yet. But I appreciate the work that's being done there, and hopefully that'll help us in the future. You know, my only thought here is I wish we had, instead of taking away one piece of data, I wish we would have introduced 10 more. And so I understand the idea of a high stakes exam, and a USMLE doesn't really correlate. I get that. But man, giving me two pieces of data, now I have one piece of data. I don't think we accomplished what we tried to accomplish. We really overemphasized another piece of data instead of kind of getting a buffet. And so I wish that we, and hope that sometime in the future we can get to 10 pieces of data, and so that not one's overvalued.
Yeah, that, Mike, if I might, I think we need to be careful with the use of the word fit. Traditionally, that has meant white guys like me who like Belgian beer and barbecue when we have an interview, and it has been an anti-diversity type thing. And so we're part of the program you mentioned with Amy and Brian and the SurgeWise group. And we assess for, we call it fit, but what it is shared values. And it's an online exam that our applicants who meet standards for academic purposes then get sent. And it's about shared values, and it actually leads to a more diverse interview pool of applicants than what we were doing previously. And so when you actually go after shared core values that are important to your institution and your department, you improve diversity. So we need to be careful how we use the word fit where that's concerned.
Great advice. All right, our next question for Dr. Johnson. Can we train general surgery residents to do open, laparoscopic, and robotic surgery as well as basic endoscopy in 5 years?
The short answer is maybe. No, I
So many
think we're all
politicians on
grappling
stage.
with that now. And I'll use an example. This year, we noticed that our incoming interns, we're seeing the effects of COVID, and I call it virtual medical school. Some of them had very few patient-to-patient interactions. We realized 3/4 of the way through the year just how far behind as a class this group was. And so we're playing the catch-up game now. And it just kind of slipped by us. Maybe we're the only program in the country that it did. But I think that what we're finding now is that a lot of the students who are matriculating through medical school, this medical schools have given them a playbook basically at day one, and they're like, this is your playbook. So we're seeing a struggle, or the learners are struggling developing their own educational plan. So it's it's been a huge challenge for us to say, okay, how do we take these folks and mentor them on developing an educational plan? And in order to accomplish all the things that we set out to accomplish, it can't just be show up for work. It's got to be you have a plan in place to do that. And it's got to be tailored for each individual learner, which is a tremendous amount of time, so that we can identify those that are struggling early. We can make sure that we're getting the cases that we need to get, the exposures that we need to get. So I think it can be done, but we're going to have to be real intentional about developing learning plans for all of our learners. And it's a pretty big task. We're just now beginning to unveil that. And again, we're a community program, so we don't have a lot of the resources that the big academic folks do in terms of teaching. So I think we can, but it's going to have to be very intentional.
So I just definitely want to add on to that one, because this is something I consider very strongly to be a fundamental mission of a general surgery program, is training a surgeon who can operate at the end of it. I've had discussions with people who believe that everyone's going to fellowship anyway, so how important is that really? And I'm like, no. If they've got that seal of approval, they need to be able to do bread and butter general surgery and do it well. We had a grand rounds professor not that long ago who was surprised that our residents, we considered it important that they could do hand-sewn intestinal anastomoses. And they said, oh, even my fellows can't do that. And I was like, okay, well, all right then. But, so clearly there is some variability in who thinks we can do it in 5 years and who doesn't, Mike. So I think you'll bring up an important point. I think the answer might lie in the EPAs, actually. So we had a great session on the EPAs, and while they're a work in progress, and I think it's going to be a lot more work before we get to the finished product, it makes perfect sense to me that there'll be someone who completes their robotic EPA when they're done. And I would hope, because I do think that's the way of the future. I have no conflicts of interest with that, but I think that's just how it's going to evolve. A lot of people going into general surgery practice will need that. Does the breast surgeon necessarily need that? Maybe not. The person that's going to be their field. But I think by having EPAs, we can ensure that the person who maybe will serve a trauma population gets all those boxes checked in being able to do fasciotomies, thoracotomies. They can do the full spectrum of that open vascular. That's where they focus their energy, and maybe a little bit less on some of the latest techniques of seed implantation in breast cancer detection, for example. So I think the EPAs may be the solution, because the short answer is all the surgical techniques out there now in the world being talked about, even just at this meeting, cannot be taught in 5 years. I mean, you can't do it all.
To pile on to what these two have said, I agree with everything that's been said. I think the question is, you think, how many reps or how much time does it take to become competent at something? And we've got data out there from British training, De Segura and Gao back in 2016, and John Hunter, who was chair of the American Board of Surgery, like to quote these papers. But, in a British training model, you need 50 cholecystectomies to meet your numbers to sit for the next exam. At 80 cholecystectomies, 50% of the trainees are deemed competent by the people evaluating them. And at 180 cholecystectomies, 90% of the trainees are deemed competent by the people evaluating them. So you only need 50, but you're only getting about 30% of the people competent. And in the literature from Europe also, there's examples of gynecologists taking 200 hysterectomies, and only 90% of them are competent and confident after 200 hysterectomies. I don't know how many of you did hysterectomies in surgical training. I did some. It took me about 3. Okay, and after that, I was teaching my second year how to do hysterectomies. And so my point is, you can ramp up to competence a whole lot faster than what those models make it happen. But what it really requires is very deliberate intent on the part of the trainee and the trainer on each case to have them become significantly more competent than they were before they walked in that room, every day, all the time. And it goes back to Vince Lombardi, practice doesn't make perfect, but perfect practice makes perfect. And so, and I think the see one, do one, teach one, while it sounds maybe antiquated, it's not crazy to set an expectation that you will ramp up to competence in an N of 3. You won't achieve it all the time, but if you try, and if you're faculty facilitators try to get you there and push you to get there, you can ramp up the competence in a whole lot fewer reps than what we're seeing today. But it takes a lot of really deliberate action on the part of both the resident and the faculty to make that happen.
Good.
I think one of the other things that we're grappling with, to piggyback on that, is as a program, and our intent is like you said, to train general surgeons to be general surgeons. I don't really care if you go do a fellowship afterwards. We want to support it, but what does a graduating resident look like in terms of a general surgeon? What do they look like? How many endocrine cases do we think they need to do in order to develop that competence? We have a bare minimum set out by the ACGME, but what do we as a program think that looks like, so that we can say, you've got to do this many cases, even though your minimums are this, we think because we have the resources, you should be doing this. Bariatrics is another thing. Most of the time it's piggied to a fellowship, but it's a huge part of our residency. I don't really want to create bariatric surgeons, but what steps of a gastric bypass do I want them to master? Because that can transcend into other technical things and other procedures. And so those are the things that we're toying with, is they may not have to do the whole entire case, but what steps do they need to have mastery of? Then we know that they can take that and apply that in different areas.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we said before. So we've done a really pretty good job from a medical knowledge perspective of saying this is what we have to know. What is it's defined as core and non-core? I forget the nomenclature. And I would actually say recently, for a few years there, it felt like we were really dumbing down the curriculum. But based on feedback from my residents, the questions and the breadth of questions being asked on the CE and those sorts of things is really broadening out again. And I love that, because there was a moment there where it felt like we were going to ask them about gallbladders and appies and basic hernias. We weren't going to ask about insulinomas. We weren't going to ask about pancreatic masses. And really that seems to be coming back around, but we haven't gotten to that level of granularity. We have bare minimum cases, but we haven't gotten to the level of how many of each of these cases and what cases are going to be really defined. Dr. McBride, I was going to ask you, because you've done some work on EPAs.
Well, I was going to say, and I would agree. I think that's where the EPAs come in. And if you haven't seen it, the full list of the EPAs that are going to be written for general surgery now has been published as of a few weeks ago. So they started with a pilot of 5, and it was gallbladders and inguinal hernias, trauma, general surgery consultation. And why am I forgetting what the 5th one? And right lower quadrant pain, API. And so they've now created the subject matter list of 14 others that I believe will cover about 90% of the cases that they do. But it's going to be an incredible amount of work to get there. But if you're not familiar with EPAs in general, the way I think about it, like when we get the professionalism evaluation, and every quarter or every month you're asked to evaluate how professional is your resident, and it's on a Likert scale and it's 1 to 5. Well, my definition of a 5 may be different than someone else's definition of a 5 or a 4 over a 3. And so there aren't a lot of anchoring to those numbers. And so it's still very subjective. What an EPA does is it gives very specific anchoring descriptions to try to eliminate the interrelator reliability. So for example, in that inguinal hernia EPA that we've now been using for a couple of years, it very specifically intraoperatively defines that a level 0 is someone who doesn't know what the anatomy is, doesn't know what the physical exam looks like, doesn't know what kind of suture to ask for, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can look at that list and go, yeah, that resident didn't know any of those things. They're a 0. Whereas a 3, and there's anchoring behaviors there, and then a 5, not only did they know all of it, I probably didn't even need to scrub. I mean, that's how clearly the anchoring behaviors, because it's not just one anchoring behavior, there's usually 5 or 6. And so if these are created for all of these disease states or operations or behaviors that we find core to being general surgeons, it will allow us to do these micro assessments. But to also circle back to one of the things you said, probably one of the best pieces of advice I've gotten in the last few years, to be very purposeful about how we teach if we're not going to get all the numbers we need, is at the scrub sink, having a conversation. What is your goal for the case today? The last time you did this case, Where did you struggle in the case? Was there a step? Was there a portion? Where's the process? And where do we want to be more efficient? Is it getting the trocars in a timely fashion? Is it dissecting out the cystic duct? Is it making sure that, the clips are placed in a parallel fashion and that you efficiently can do these steps? So that it's not, so every case isn't about the entire operation. It's about what are the one or two steps you want to work on this case to get competent in that part. And as I shifted how I became a teacher, I do think it has helped me get the residents and fellows to competence faster. And then if you couple an EPA to that at the end of the case, then you can give them very specific and concrete feedback on how they did to get to their goal. Well, this is the goal we stated for the case, and here's how you did on the goal. All right, this was a gallbladder EPA. We had these goals, and you did it. It was a moderately difficult case. You used your two hands. You were able to do all these things, and you were competent, or you were proficient, or you were ready for independent practice. And this is what you did well. And these are the things I suggest we work on next time.
I love it. Next question, we're going to switch a little bit towards how we are evaluating our residents. So we all know that the QE and the CE are important. Dr. Desanayake, so the QE, additive or duplicative assessment after 5 years of the ABSITE?
So I would say totally different, actually. So the ABSITE is what we have, and I think we all use it, but we all know it has no external validity in the sense of we don't use it as a grading system. We're not supposed to, right? It's supposed to be a self-evaluation, whereas the board exam is very much a external bar which you must pass to then go out and hopefully have a job. And I will say, I think it's different. I think the board, I'm not familiar exactly with how the ABSITE develops its questions every year, what kind of processes they use. I'm sure they use some good ones, but the board uses a very rigorous system of its questions and its psychometric assessments and making sure things are fair and even. So I really think it is essential, whereas the ABSITE is optional. And if there were to be a competitor to the ABSITE, or you could do it twice a year instead of once a year, I think all of that would be fine. I don't think, in fact, I would kind of like to see this once a year, what should be low stakes, but has now become a high stakes exam diluted a little. I think that would help to have more frequent assessments that maybe mattered a little bit less. So, I think there's lots of things we can do with the ABSITE. Is a once a year, once after your graduation, one time didactic knowledge assessment the best way to assess didactic knowledge? We could probably discuss that for an hour, but I think for now it's fairly good and it's a useful metric to have. And I don't think we have a viable alternative to replace it. The part I enjoy more, honestly, is the certifying exam, the oral exam. I think that's a lot more fun. And I think by talking, not just to give as an examiner, but by talking to the candidate and allowing them to talk through their thought process, I really do feel like there's just no substitute for that to assess how someone works through a complex surgical problem. And so to me, both the QE and the CE are complementary to each other. And I haven't seen a better option come up yet.
All right, I don't see anybody else grabbing the mic, so I will ask a follow-up question to Dr. Dent. The virtual CE, which was a byproduct largely of COVID, win, lose, or draw?
I'll say 90% win. It got us out of hotel rooms, which the board had been trying to do for a long time. The inappropriateness of examining in someone's hotel room was not lost on people, but we hadn't found a better alternative, and we're in active searching mode for better alternatives when COVID hit. If you look at the exam performance, it's the same as it was with in-room exams. If you look at surveys of examinees, way less angst, way less cost, way less travel. And so the examinees, 90% favor staying virtual on the examinee end. The only thing I worry about, it's more anecdote than data, is I think that having the examiners together had some merit. The group of 6 in a pod would get together at the end of every exam of 3 people. And the discussion that followed would be kind of a standard setting exercise. As a young examiner years ago, I learned kind of how other people were grading, and it allowed me to adjust my grading of people at that time. And I think it's a team building exercise, both the short meetings between sessions, the breakfast together, the dinner together, because when the board is a team and the first dysfunction of a team is lack of trust, and you have to build trust for it to be there. So we're considering going forward a hybrid model where examiners get together in a hotel, but examine from their hotel rooms while the examinees can stay home or be wherever. But we can sit together at a table and go over questions in the morning, and we can get together at lunch and go over the afternoon's questions and things like that to build the trust, the teamwork, and the standard setting among examiners while preserving the optimal situation doing Zoom exams, which seems to be the case as viewed from the examinee's perspective.
Yeah, I'd say from the examinee perspective, I've seen some of these surveys. I've seen even on social media, Twitter, the response. And I would say it's been an unqualified success from their perspective. And kudos to the board for pulling off something that was very difficult at the right time in a timely fashion, and then doing it well. That was a huge undertaking, and I think, man, it's hard for me to imagine going back to the way that it used to be. But the hybrid model is particularly interesting to me. Dr. Johnson, you can only teach 3 inguinal hernia repairs to a general surgery resident in 2022. What should they be?
You gave me the easiest question of all. No, being the surgical educator that I am, he kind of prepped the question. So I immediately sent it to my 3 residents that are here and said, I can only teach you 3. I can only do 3 hernias with you during this academic year. What 3 hernias am I going to do with you? And all 3 gave me 3 different answers. So I think, one of them said, it depends on where I'm going in the country. This is my chief resident, depends on where I'm going, what kind of resources they have. If they have a robot, I want to do robotic taps with you. If they don't have a robot, I want to do laparoscopic. If it's a very small area where they have lack of good laparoscopic, I want to do 3 open Liechtenstein with you. And so I think part of the question is really doing a needs assessment and seeing, where you are. If I had my personal preference, boy, I tell you, all of my partners do laparoscopic and robotic. I might choose a good old open Liechtenstein because I think there's still some value in teaching the residents to do open inguinal hernia repairs, even though if it's me, I probably would want something different, but that's just, it's kind of a really hard question to answer. And which I know is why you're asking it. So I'd be curious to hear from the others as well.
So one of the things we're doing this year is starting a rural track it out program. And we've always wanted to train solid general surgeons, and that's always been part of our mission. But we've realized that given where we're located in Lubbock, Texas, we have an obligation, and we have been fulfilling it mostly, to populate surgeons in rural Texas, because that's a severe shortage right now. And so this question actually does come up. And interestingly, as we explore it, it becomes clear that it's not just open repairs. You do need actually robotic experience to be a rural surgeon and have a successful practice these days. And so I do think just what he said is absolutely correct. It depends on where you're going. As we developed the curriculum for the rural program, we realized that the other cohort that's very interested in this is those who want to make global surgery part of their practice once they graduate. And they want to know how to do that operation under resource settings. So we're going to work that in as well. And so I think there's just a lot of opportunity. But again, this comes down to me, the EPA's is so far the only proposal that might fit this, where different people can get somewhat different things out of residency and still keep it to 5 years. I did have a quick question, Mike.
Please.
Are we going to talk about unionization at all and how that might be a challenge? Because it says right there, we want challenges to resident education. And I was just curious if anyone in the room has a unionized residency. Anyone? Okay, so a few people, and it's a minority, but it's increasing. And I was just interested in how that might be a challenge. And I don't know much about it. And I was just, wanted to bring it up.
Let's, it looks like we're gonna have a few minutes at the end. Let's bring that up as the last question. This idea of 3 approaches, there's so many hernia approaches, right? And taking away the modality, whether it's lap or robotic, I sat down one day and I said, okay, if I have to teach them 3, what am I going to make sure they know? So they're going to have to know how to do an open tension-free repair. For us, that's a Liechtenstein. They really need to know an MIS approach. And for us, that's a lap or robotic tap, which I've kind of fallen in love with, if I'm honest with you. It's my favorite repair. It's fun to do. The anatomy is great. Seeing it from the inside is so much better than seeing it from the outside, but seeing it from both sides is finally, it all made sense, right? I could stare at Netter for years and never have quite figured it out. And then lastly, they need a tissue repair. So McVeigh. And so I hammer those three into our residents. I oral boards prep them for those three over and over and over again. And I will tell you, 4 years in a row, they see McVeigh's, they talk about McVeigh's, they still struggle to describe a McVeigh. But I think it's critically important for them when they come out. Dan?
I would just say, I'm coming to an end of my term as the chair of the certifying exam committee for the board. I think there are probably a fair number of people that can do some of these repairs, but they can't describe them well.
Yeah.
And so having prepped your residents on how to describe the anatomy, rather than I'm going to get some good stuff here and some good stuff there and sew them together, is probably time well spent in your residency program. And then the last thing I'll add is that if I get a hernia today, I want an open repair under local. Okay, Dr. Potts agrees. Okay, with the data that's coming out on the impact of general anesthesia on cognitive decline, I want to stay away from a general anesthetic. I want an open repair under local if I need a hernia repair tomorrow.
Noted. Last question I have, and we've got about 10 minutes, so we'll hopefully have time for the unionization question. Sharmila, so SCORE, standalone surgical education resource or just one tool in the toolbox?
Just one tool in the toolbox. That's the first unequivocal answer I'll give you. Yeah, there is no way. I mean, SCORE is made by humans, and by definition, we're going to get things wrong. We're going to be behind the times. Things are going to get updated that don't get updated in time. And so I think there is still no substitute for learning about the patient you have in front of you by reading a textbook or SCORE for your base, and then doing some research. We just had that great panel on diverticulitis, and it's clear you absolutely have to have some sense of the current literature to be able to even put the question of which operation to do in perspective and to support whichever decision you make. I don't think it's enough, honestly. It may be enough for a second-year resident. I think that's fine. But by the time you have a chief resident, I would very much expect them to be able to give me some literature-based reasoning for what they're doing in addition to what they learned from SCORE.
I think SCORE has really helped the board and hopefully helped those prepping for their board exams to recognize what the scope of general surgery is. And like Dr. Disaneki said, that's an ever-changing target, and SCORE may not have it right on any given day, but it works iteratively to try to get it better. But what it's done for the board exam, and referring back to your comment earlier, Mike, the scope of the exam, I think, has become more appropriate. And at first, when the scope got narrowed some, I thought it had just become easier, and probably wrongly so. But the truth is, for example, the patient with mesenteric vascular disease that comes in with some ischemic bowel, what do you expect a 5-year general surgery graduate to do in that case? It's appropriate to expect the 5-year general surgery graduate to manage the bowel and to work collaboratively with someone who can revascularize. But to expect a 5-year general surgery graduate to technically describe in detail how to do an SMA bypass is probably inappropriate. And so we've noticed the scope of things like that. And ditto for doing a Whipple. If you can describe the basics of a Whipple, you'll probably pass the test. You don't have to know exactly what suture to use on your duct-to-duct anastomosis after a 5-year general surgery training. And so keeping the scope appropriate, SCORE has allowed us to look at what is core, what is advanced, and keep the scope of the exam appropriate. It doesn't mean there aren't some advanced questions on the test or questions like the SMA example where there's some core work with an advanced piece to it, and you need to know some of both. But it has allowed us, I think, to focus the exam appropriately for what we expect of a general surgery graduate.
Dr. McBride.
I was also going to say, I think it also helps just at the program development level, ensuring, to your point, I think early on, ensuring that the residents are getting the didactics that they need over the course of the year. I mean, it gives you a list of the lectures you need to make sure that they have and that you can go through it. I mean, I was actually just this fall, one of my partners and I got assigned, and I can't think what the topic was, probably stomach or something. But it was going to be 2 lectures 2 weeks apart. And it made it very easy to say, you cover these score topics and I cover these score topics. So we ensured that they didn't get 2 lectures that covered almost the same things. And then there were a whole bunch of topics that they didn't do. So you can give the speakers very clear ideas.
Yep.
These are the things that need to be in the lecture as you are lecturing to the residents, so that people are not just going in to give their didactic talks on the topics they want to be talking on, and they spend way too much time on one very minor point, and very major points get ignored.
Yeah, we found that really, really beneficial to our subspecialists. So when I ask our OBGYN colleagues to come give us a topic like, hey, here's the stuff that our organization, that we need to know. Because otherwise they talk about their research focus that is not really germane. I want to hear that too, but I want to hear this other stuff first. Let's go ahead and open this up for questions. We got about 5 minutes. Why don't we begin with, I saw a couple of people raising their hands to Dr. Desanike's question about unionization. And if anybody else had a question or a comment that came up as a result of the previous questions, feel free to make your way to the mic.
Bridget Pay from New Mexico. So I know our residents are unionized. I think Dr. Russell can echo that. I can speak a little bit to my own experience. I was a UC Davis resident, and the vote for unionization came up, and I will remember Jim Goodnight, God bless him, he said, I am not your boss. I am your mentor and I am your teacher, and that's not the relationship we're going to have, and it was voted down. But UCSF had a very different experience because they were living in, at that time, $2,000 a month, apartments, and they couldn't have cars, and it was a very different situation. Our own residents, I felt like there's been some tension between what the institution, the University of New Mexico can do and what the union can do. Days off is a nightmare every single year because the union doesn't talk to the university, and what the university even wants to do for the residents, they can't do because the union won't allow it, and vice versa. So I think it's a hot mess, but no one asked me before they decided.
Well, actually, I asked you, so thank you. Yeah, because, and let me tell you where this is coming from. Unionization, and just so everyone knows, I think it's been a wonderful step forward for this country in the labor market, and to allow people rights and proper compensation. So I'm not trying to slam unions by any means, but I do find that the juxtaposition of a learner with a unionized model is problematic for a few reasons, because you do immediately become management instead of mentor. And in fact, some of the things that we may consider traditional mentor roles become impossible with a union. I'll give you one example. I know of a program where you cannot take your residents out for lunch after clinic because it is illegal to do anything with 2 or 3 residents that you don't then offer to the entire residency, which obviously makes no literal sense if you're just popping out after clinic with the people who are there. And that's a very small, trivial example, but it speaks to that relationship that we have all cherished for so long, being, to me, potentially under threat if this is not managed well. So thank you for your perspective.
Hello, Evan Kelly. I've just graduated residency. Now I'm a fellow in Crosby, Minnesota, the Minnesota Institute for Minimally Invasive Surgery, but Dr. Johnson was my program director. So just to kind of talk from personal experience. We don't like talking about money as physicians because that's not why we go into it, but I think the situation is coming to a head because most residency programs are in big urban centers where it's getting more and more and more expensive to live, especially with inflation and all the macro factors. But the economics of the way that the pay structures are built is broken. So we see nurses and PAs and MPs, they come right out of schooling without getting any education. They're learning on the job, just like we're learning on the job. They're getting paid much higher. And the reason is because they can leave the institution and they can go across the street and say, give me more money. There's a supply and demand factor. And right now there's not enough nurses. So nurses are getting higher pay, and that's how economics works in this country. However, with residents, you match, you're lucky to match, and then you sign a 5-year agreement that you cannot leave and you're held hostage. And the way that physician pay or resident pay is based on MGMA data, fair market value. But the fair market value is never going to go up when there's no competition because residents are stuck where they're at. So the compensation does not keep up with inflation. So inflation's been going crazy and resident compensation is the same. And that is why we're in the issue we're in. And as a resident, it's a national issue. So even if you work with your hospital to try and get a meager amount of extra pay, it's not enough because it's a national issue. So we need societies like this to understand that and not realize that just greedy and want more money, but to kind of just at least at a minimum keep up with inflation. And that's kind of the situation as we see it from as residents.
Thank you.
I'll take that on. You're right that it's a big challenge. I don't have an easy solution that gets residents. I highly value residents. If I were making the pay scale, I would give them a lot more. I don't have an easy solution for how to fix that. With that said, taking the long view, resident pay has outpaced inflation. Resident pay raises have outpaced inflation. Every institution that I know of looks at what they pay their residents every year and compares it to their peers in the local geographic area. We compare to everybody in Texas every year, and we want to be number one in Texas. And so there's a race each year, and we have gone up significantly in the last 5 years as a result of that. So it actually is outpacing inflation in terms of resident pay. But most residents don't realize, and I gave this talk at this meeting a couple of years ago, but most residents don't realize, do you know what the average full-time employee in the US makes today? It's about half of what a resident makes. Okay, so residents make almost double what the average 40-hour per week full-time employee in the United States makes. So residents think they're poor and they think they're in the bottom 10 percentile of income folks, but they're not. But you're right in terms of the living situations. Having to live near a hospital in New York City or San Francisco or Boston on a resident salary is a real challenge. And so that's why I'm not suggesting everything is hunky-dory. It is better than it used to be. But having it tied to Medicare, Medicaid dollars for most residency positions in the country it's a big giant mess to unweave and try to create a new model. And I don't know a solution to how to make that happen.
Just to add to what Dr. Dent said as well. So most of you know about the Medicare cap, right? And interestingly, recently we did have some more Medicare spots open up, but for most of us in the Southwest, which is where this Congress is based, we are way over our cap, which means that every new resident is being paid private dollars, essentially. It's being paid from the hospital, it's being paid from the institutions. And that allows some flexibility, as Dan alluded to, in pay structure, because we're not actually tied to Medicare dollars, whereas some of the older institutions, especially on the coast, are tied very strongly to Medicare. So that's another cause of discrepancy. And so the irony is that the places in the country that have lower cost of living often are the ones where they have more flexibility in the payment as well. So it is a great point, and I'm glad we brought it up. And I think this is something that probably deserves further discussion at a dedicated session.
Yeah, just to reemphasize the point you made is really valid. One of the Serge Onk fellows recently at a major academic institution pointed out that as a PGY 10 last year Serge Onk fellow, he made half as much as the PA resident who was first year out of PA school at that same institution. And there are a 1-year residency training program they have for PA residents. And so that's just wrong. That sort of thing needs to be.
Real quick, we are out of time. Stay at the mic though. So if you want to leave, we abut a break. And so I don't want to steal your break. If you want to go talk to the industry folks or grab a drink, feel free to do that. If you leave though quietly, if you want to talk for 3 or 4 more minutes, I'm happy to sit here and talk for 3 or 4 minutes. We've got a 15-minute break, middle mic.
Hi, Brad Reams. I'm a faculty now at the University of Nebraska, but I did fellowship training. I actually did my residency program at the University of Michigan. And we had a House Officers Union. And so I just speak from my also personal experience as a trainee as opposed to an administrative perspective. But I guess the things that I would say is that union allowed us to have a spectacular educational environment at our institution. And kind of to sort of address some of the comments that have been made in this discussion, certainly if it's not a well-run union and it's not a well-run hospital administration, it's going to be a disaster. But if it's well-run on both sides, there are so many issues beyond simply pay that the union addressed that made our training so much better than the average program at that time nationally. And a lot of them were very little details that the union allowed us to address because it's representing 1,500 to 1,800 employees of the hospital that make the entire hospital run. And the other thing I'd say is, you know, the
Actually,
union
before you move to
discussion-
the other thing, can you give some examples? Because I really do want to know and I want to hear this, because as you can tell, what is being talked about tends to be the more negative experiences. Can you elaborate a bit more? Because this is great to hear. And I knew Michigan had a union and the residents seemed very happy with it.
Absolutely. And, you know, and we can have lots more discussions if you'd like. I mean, the simplest thing that I was thinking about that is that a lot of the thing, you know, there's been a progressive change in inclusion and equality and, you know, gender bias issues in training that is now seems to be much more commonplace now. You know, 10, 15 years ago, it was not, but it all existed at Michigan because of the union. So, you know, that allowed us to be very far ahead of the national game with regards to the educational, social, emotional well-being aspect of residents, which allows the residents to learn better and to perform better in their roles. And so all of it was a lot more than just what is the salary and the benefits that someone's getting. And the one, you know, the other final point that I want to make is, you know, the union discussions were always from the union leadership representing all of the trainees and the hospital administration leadership. And it had absolutely nothing to do with the individual faculty or program or Department of Surgery leadership and the trainees. So what was happening in the union and the negotiations, which were typical union negotiations, they were very difficult. They were fraught and tense at times. That never in any way, shape, or form impacted my experience with a single surgical faculty, including my program director, my chairman, et cetera. And so I definitely think it's a little bit of a mistake to view that it would change that in any way. I think from a trainee perspective, a union only dramatically improves the overall experience of training.
Well, thank you. Dr. Potts, past president, had a question about, or a comment maybe on simulation in CE.
Thank you, Mike. I just wanted to ask Dan and some of the others perhaps, whether simulation has been considered as an alternative to the traditional CE. You know, whether you sit in a hotel room or you do it on Zoom, one thing that we've always lacked is the ability to see a resident operate. I said always, and that's incorrect, because in the early days of the board, as you know, board members actually traveled out and watched candidates in their own setting do operations before they certified them. Is there any chance that simulation will now become a part of the CE?
Actually, what's being seriously discussed is video-based assessment of trainees doing videotape of themselves operating and sending outside their residency to another program or a third party for assessment of technical competence as part of their training prior to graduation. Is probably a couple of years away, and the resources necessary to do the videotape, who's going to judge them, who's going to, you know, rate them, that sort of thing. A lot of details are still being worked out, and they're being worked out by the assessment committee, which has representatives from all the boards, the pediatric surgery board, the surg-onc board, the vascular board. And so, but that is being seriously discussed, is video-based assessment, not simulation, but actual operative videos.
All right, last question and we'll conclude.
Chad Hall from Temple, Texas. Just to go back to the specifics of the unionization and kind of what it provided. I was a fellow at OHSU the year they unionized. And so some of the specifics that went out, like the institution was moving to Spock Mobile and getting away from carrying pagers. So part of the union negotiated, well, if my phone that I'm paying for is all of a sudden become a necessary work tool. And so it led to a stipend to pay for cell phone bills, and it led to a housing stipend because rent in Portland had skyrocketed. Led to better negotiations for healthcare coverage, and so you're paying lower premiums for residents. It wasn't necessarily stipend; it was all the extra things that the money goes to.
Thank you for that. Appreciate the panelists and the audience with such great questions. Enjoy a few minutes of your break and have a great day. Thank you.